I want to start with a simple observation. Not a theory, not a conspiracy. Just an observation that once I made it, I couldn't stop making everywhere I looked. A bridge should fit its traffic. That's not a controversial statement. That's engineering logic. You build a road wide enough for the carts passing over it. You build a bridge to match that road. You build piers thick enough to support the loads you expect. Arches tall enough to clear the boats or floodwaters beneath. And parapets wide enough that travellers don't accidentally fall off the edge. Form follows function. That's the whole story of pre-industrial architecture, right? Necessity drives design, so why doesn't it? The first time I noticed the problem, I was looking at images of the Pont d'Iéna in Paris, built, we're told, in the early 19th century to celebrate Napoleon's victories, 28 metres wide. 4 lanes essentially, plus generous pedestrian walkways. Massive stone piers rising from the Seine like the knuckles of a buried giant. And the question that crept into the back of my mind was so simple it almost felt stupid to ask it. Who was using all that space? Napoleon's Paris was a city of horses, carts and foot traffic. 28 metres is wide for a modern vehicle bridge, for horse-drawn transport in 1813. It's extraordinary. I looked for crowd paintings, for documentation of dense traffic crossing it in those early years. I found ceremonial imagery. I found depictions of a mostly empty, beautiful, oversized span. I set the thought aside. Probably just ambition. Probably just the imperial aesthetic. And then I started looking at other bridges. That's where it gets uncomfortable. The deeper I looked, the less satisfying the word aesthetic became. Consider the Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome, the bridge leading to the Castel Sant'Angelo, originally constructed under the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, but substantially rebuilt and expanded over the following centuries. Its current width, its massive riverside platform, its extraordinary load-bearing capacity, all of this, we are told, served pilgrims, foot traffic, and the occasional procession. And yet the engineering in the stone is not pedestrian engineering. The submerged foundations are not pedestrian foundations. Engineers who have examined the subsurface structure report piling work and cut stone bedding that would be, frankly, overkill for anything short of significant mechanical load. Overkill. That word kept coming back to me. Move forward in time. Move north. The old bridges of Central Europe, the Karls Bridge in Prague, the historic stone bridges of Heidelberg all share certain characteristics. Extraordinary width relative to the traffic records we have for them. Massive pier construction. Load tolerances that appear, based on the engineering, to comfortably exceed horse and cart use. And in almost every case, the official documentation of their construction is thinner than you'd expect. Records of funding. Records of labour. Records of the specific engineering decisions that led to those particular proportions. Missing. Incomplete. Lost to fire or flood, or the simple passage of time. Or so we're told. The Steinerne Brücke in Regensburg, constructed across the Danube beginning around 1135, officially one of the oldest surviving stone bridges in Germany, 16 arches, 336 metres long. A roadway width of approximately 8 metres, consistent along the entire span. It was, historians tell us, a vital trade, artery, and yes, Regensburg was a significant medieval trading city. I'm not dismissing that, but look at the Danube's width at that crossing point. Look at what a functional crossing for medieval commercial traffic actually required. And then look at what was built. The scale is not proportional to the documented need. That's not an emotional reaction. That is a measurement problem, and here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. I began cataloguing bridges, not randomly, not selectively. I cast the net wide across Europe, across Central Asia, into what historical records awkwardly call the Eurasian steppe region, into territories that appear on 16th and 17th century maps bearing the label Tartaria, Grand Tartary, Tartaria Magna. That label, by the way, was not marginal. Encyclopaedia Britannica's 1771 edition devoted substantial coverage to Tartaria as a real geographic and arguably civilizational entity. And then, gradually, across subsequent editions, across the 19th century, it shrank, the entries shortened, the territory fragmented, and eventually it disappeared, redistributed into Russia, China, Central Asia, absorbed into other narratives, gone, as if it had never been geographically coherent at all. I'm not telling you what that means. I'm noting that it happened, because when I look at the bridges of those territories, the bridges of what was once labelled Tartaria on European maps, I find the same anomaly repeating. Width, mass, structural sophistication, scale disproportionate to the traffic documented in official histories. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. At this point, the standard response kicks in. I've heard it many times. They were built for prestige. Kings and emperors wanted monuments to their greatness. The extra width was symbolic. The massive stonework was theatre. The scale was meant to impress, not accommodate. And I want to take this argument seriously, because it deserves to be taken seriously. Prestige architecture is real. Monumental construction for symbolic purposes is well documented throughout history. The Egyptians built temples with roof beams that could have held up a mountain because the scale was the message. We understand that. But here's where the prestige argument collapses. A window can be oversized for aesthetic reasons. A doorway can be grand far beyond any practical need. And we see this in cathedrals and palaces all over Europe. Doorways 30 feet tall that humans of any historical era could never have needed for practical ingress. Nobody walks in holding a giraffe. We accept that as symbolic architecture and move on. A bridge is different. A bridge is, at its core, a functional object. It exists to allow crossing. Every element of its construction, the width of the deck, the thickness of the piers, the span of the arches, the depth of the foundations, those are engineering decisions. They cost money, they cost labour, they cost time. An oversized window costs the glassmaker an extra day. An oversized bridge pier costs a quarry, a barge fleet, a workforce of hundreds, and months of additional construction. You don't make a bridge pier 3 times thicker than it needs to be for atmosphere. Not unless the thickness is actually needed. And that's where the prestige argument becomes impossible to ignore in its inadequacy. Because what we see across dozens of historical bridges in Europe, the Middle East and Central Asia is not decorative excess. It is structural capacity. These bridges could bear enormous weight. They were built to bear enormous weight. The question is simply, what weight? Let me make the scale argument concrete. The Pont Neuf in Paris, the oldest standing bridge across the Seine, completed in 1607. Width, approximately 22 metres. It has 12 arches. Its construction involved engineering solutions that historians still consider sophisticated by early modern standards. And the traffic it was built to serve. Early 17th century Paris had an estimated population of somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people, most of them on foot or horseback. Wheeled vehicle use was restricted on many Parisian streets during this era due to congestion. 22 metres for a city that was restricting wheels on its streets. Move eastward. The Great Bridge at Mostar in Bosnia, the Stari Most, old bridge, destroyed in the 1990s, war and rebuilt. Its width relative to its length, the thickness of its single arch, the engineering of its abutments, which were cut directly into the living rock of the cliff faces on either side. It crossed a river in a small Herzegovinian town, a town that, at its historical peak under Ottoman administration, had perhaps a few thousand permanent inhabitants. The bridge, in proportion to that town, is extraordinary. You could argue Ottoman prestige architecture, you could. But then you're back to the problem. Bridge engineering isn't decorative. The abutment work, the arch geometry, the load calculations embedded in that span, those are decisions about what the bridge needs to carry, not what it needs to look like. Go to the Carriageways Bridge in Isfahan, Iran. Officially constructed around 1650 under Shah Abbas II, it functions as both a bridge and a weir across the Zayanda River, 14 metres wide, 132 metres long. 2 full levels of arcaded galleries, tea houses, private royal alcoves and public promenades built directly into the structure. It is, on its face, a civic masterpiece, and historians are right to call it that. But 14 metres wide. For a bridge across a river serving a pre-industrial Safavid Persian city, 14 metres of carriageway, not including the gallery walkways on either side, implies a traffic density that strains every demographic figure historians cite for 17th century Isfahan. Even at the city's peak population, estimated at somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 people, the daily flow of wheeled traffic requiring a 14-metre bridge crossing is improbable. At best, travel northwest into the Caucasus, travel east into Central Asia, travel along the corridors that 16th century European mapmakers coloured Tartaria. You find bridges with the same proportional excess, same heavy stone, same wide carriageways, same apparent engineering confidence, different countries, different centuries officially, different ruling powers, but the same scale problem, embedded in the stone itself. How do you coordinate that? How does an architectural anomaly repeat, not as a single exceptional project, but as a pattern across thousands of miles and supposedly disconnected civilizations? The official answer involves trade networks, shared aesthetic traditions, and the diffusion of Roman engineering knowledge. But Roman bridges, while often impressive, were built to serve Roman infrastructure, the actual documented traffic of a known imperial road system. The Roman scale makes sense against the Roman record. This other scale, the one I keep finding, does not have an equivalent record. There is no documentation, no census data, no trade manifesto that accounts for why so many bridges in so many places were built for a volume of traffic that official history says never existed. And that silence, that absence of explanation, is deafening. I want to address the giant theory, not to mock it, but to examine what it's really saying when you strip away the more theatrical versions. The claim, in its most persistent form, is this: that pre-flood or pre-reset humanity included beings of significantly greater physical stature than modern humans, and that the scale of certain architectural features, wide bridges, tall doorways, enormous saddle rings on palatial staircases, reflects the ergonomic needs of those beings rather than purely symbolic intention. Is it true? I don't know. I'm not a physical anthropologist. But here's what I find interesting about the giant theory as it applies to bridges specifically. It doesn't actually require literal giants to make a structural point. The structural point is this: if the beings using these bridges were larger, heavier, and travelled in larger groups or with larger vehicles than anything the 19th century record describes, then the bridge dimensions make perfect rational sense. You don't need mythology, you just need a different traffic profile. What would that profile look like? Heavier wagons, wider vehicles, denser convoys, a type of wheeled transport significantly more substantial than the horse-drawn cart. Something, in short, closer to what we would call mechanized or semi-mechanized transport, or at the very least, a civilization using draft animals and vehicles at a scale we have no record of. The deeper I went into this question, the more I found myself returning to a simple observation. The bridges are consistent with their own internal logic. They're not random in their excess. The width, the pier thickness, the arch span, the foundation depth, they all scale together. These aren't bridges where one element is inexplicably oversized while the rest is normal. Everything is proportional. Everything speaks to the same load profile. Whatever they were built for it deliberately and intelligently. I want to be precise about what I mean when I use the word Tartaria, because it gets misused constantly. In official historical records, cartographic records, trade documents, encyclopedias going back centuries, Tartaria or Great Tartary referred to a vast geographic and cultural region spanning from the Caspian Sea east, across Central Asia and into Siberia, and even parts of North America, on some maps. This wasn't a fringe idea. It appeared in mainstream European cartography well into the 18th century. The 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica, first edition, contains a substantial entry on Tartary, describing it as the largest country in the world, stretching from the borders of Moscow to the Pacific. And then, quite abruptly, it disappears, not gradually, not absorbed piecemeal into emerging nation-states with a paper trail of treaties and transitions. It disappears from maps, from encyclopedias, from the working vocabulary of geographers and historians. Theorists argue that this disappearance corresponds with a civilizational reset, a catastrophic event that destroyed or buried an older, more advanced civilization and allowed a new historical narrative to be written more or less from scratch. I'm not asking you to accept that. I'm asking you to sit with the disappearance. Because here is what the Tartaria hypothesis, at its most intellectually honest, actually proposes. That the bridges, the grand civic buildings, the canal systems and the rail infrastructure we attribute to the 19th century may in some cases be repurposings, inheritances from an earlier civilization whose actual scale, technology and population density has been radically underrepresented in the history we've received. That the builders we credit were in many cases the inheritors, not the originators, and that the proportions of the structures they quote-unquote built reflect the needs of whoever came before them. Does that explain the bridge widths? It might. And here's why the idea is worth sitting with. The scale problem isn't local. It isn't one bridge, one city, one country. It appears across Europe and Central Asia with what I can only describe as unsettling uniformity. As if all of these builders across different centuries and different cultures and different political regimes were following instructions they didn't fully understand, matching a template they'd been handed without being told what it was originally for. Here is what I keep coming back to. Here is what feels to me like the center of everything. When a civilization builds on this scale, it leaves records. It leaves administrative documents, construction ledgers, labor requisitions, quarry records, engineering specifications. The Romans built extensively across Europe, and they left voluminous records. We know the names of the engineers, we know the supply chains, we know the approximate workforce, we know the costs, we know where the stone came from. For many of the bridges I'm describing, the ones with the unexplained width, the ones in territories that once bore the Tartarian label, the records are thin, fragmentary, often absent, not absent in the way that records become absent through neglect and time. Those absences have a texture to them, a randomness. Absent in the way that suggests the records either never existed or have been systematically removed. This raises a simple but critical question. Who decides what survives? Because the official answer, that time, fire, flood and neglect explain the archival gaps, requires us to accept that precisely the most impressive and anomalous structures had precisely the worst documentation luck, again and again, across multiple cultures, across multiple centuries. Not one or two cases, not a reasonable statistical scatter. A pattern where the bigger the discrepancy between the structure's scale and the official narrative, the thinner the documentation, as if the records and the structures existed in an inverse relationship to each other. As if someone somewhere understood that the records were the problem. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. I have spent a long time with these bridges now, looking at them in photographs and architectural surveys and the occasional in-person visit when geography permitted. And I want to tell you what it feels like standing on one of them. It feels like standing in a space designed for more than you, not physically threatening, not alienating in a dramatic way, just larger than the moment, larger than the context, the kind of space that makes you feel quietly that some original purpose has been forgotten and that the current use, the tourist, the occasional car, the lone cyclist, is a pale imitation of whatever this space was made to hold. That could be poetic projection. I acknowledge that, but it could also be accurate memory. The body standing in a proportioned space registers proportion. And what I register on these bridges is not the scale of a civilization, I know. It is the scale of something else, something whose population, whose movement, whose daily requirements were simply different, larger, more voluminous, more connected than the period history assigns to these structures. The evidence suggests something much larger was happening here. Not mythology, not conspiracy, just scale, just stone and mortar arranged in proportions that imply a world we are not being told about. And the reason that matters, the reason I keep pushing on this, the reason I keep finding myself at 3 a.m. looking at bridge surveys and medieval population estimates and old Eurasian cartography, is not because I need to prove that Tartaria was real, or that giants walked the earth, or that someone is lying to us. It's because the alternative is equally strange. The alternative is that for centuries, across thousands of miles, across dozens of supposedly independent and disconnected civilizations, architects and engineers and labourers built bridges that dramatically exceeded functional requirements, as if following instructions they didn't fully understand, as if inheriting blueprints from somewhere upstream in time and building from them faithfully, without knowing why. That is not less mysterious than the other explanations. That may, in fact, be more. I don't have an answer for you. I want to be clear about that, and I want you to be clear about that. What I have is a question that will not resolve itself, and a set of physical objects, these bridges, these absurdly, beautifully disproportionate bridges that refuse to be explained away by the standard narrative. Who built them, really? What moved across them? How many people travelling how regularly justified this investment in stone and labour and engineering skill, repeated across a continent, across centuries, in places that official history insists were remote and sparsely populated? What did the world look like? What did it actually look like? On the ground, in motion, in the daily flow of bodies and goods and transport, before the maps were redrawn and the encyclopedias were edited and the labels fell away. The deeper I go, the more I think these bridges are not just infrastructure, they are testimony. They are the most durable statement a civilization can make. Harder to burn than a library, harder to erase than a map, harder to dismiss than a legend. Stone laid by human hands across moving water, built to carry a weight and a volume that official history cannot fully account for. Something moved across these bridges, something real, something substantial. And somewhere in the gap between what we're told and what the stone suggests, there is a history we have not fully recovered. Maybe we never will, but the bridges are still here, patient, proportioned for something we've forgotten. Still waiting for the traffic that never came, or the traffic that came and was erased.